The heavy mahogany office at the center of the estate was supposed to smell like dark roast Arabica beans, aged leather bindings, and the faint, sweet trace of pipe tobacco. Tonight, it smelled exclusively like lighter fluid and burning parchment. The coroner's van had not even cleared the bottom of the long gravel driveway. The flashing red and blue lights were still painting the wet, rain-slicked trunks of the oak trees outside the massive bay windows. Yet, the two people standing in front of the stone fireplace had not shed a single tear. They had not embraced. They had not spoken a word of grief or remembrance for the man whose body had just been carried out of the master bedroom upstairs. They had gone straight for the desk. I stood motionless in the shadowed doorway of the office, the heavy silver tray carrying 3 untouched mugs of black coffee still balanced in my hands. I watched them work with a sickening or frantic energy that completely betrayed their expensive, perfectly tailored morning clothes. Richard, my father, was violently tearing through the bottom left drawer of the massive antique desk. His gold Rolex watch scraped carelessly against the historic wood, a sound that would have made the old man furious. Beside him, Evelyn, my mother, was kneeling on the imported Persian rug in her black designer heels. She was holding a heavy iron poker, aggressively stabbing at the bright, unnaturally high flames roaring in the stone hearth. It was the middle of July. There was absolutely no reason to have a fire burning in the study. "Did you get the envelope?" Richard hissed, his voice a frantic, breathless whisper as he pulled a stack of heavily stamped legal folders from the drawer and tossed them carelessly onto the polished desktop. He said he kept the final copy in the bottom drawer, the one with the red wax seal. I have it right here." "I just keep looking for any duplicates," Evelyn snapped back, her voice tight with a toxic mix of panic and absolute euphoria. She wasn't holding the iron poker anymore. She was holding a thick, cream-colored, legal envelope. Even from the doorway, I could clearly see the distinct, heavy crimson wax seal pressed into the flap. It was the exact envelope the estate lawyer had hand-delivered exactly 3 weeks ago. The envelope that contained the final, notarized will and testament, and the document that legally transferred 100% of the 200-acre coffee roastery, the historic farmhouse, and the massive corporate accounts to the person who had actually spent the last 10 years running it. Miss Evelyn did not open the envelope to read it. She did not care about the final words or wishes of the man she had entirely ignored for the last 15 years. She simply stared at the heavy cream paper with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, and then tossed the entire sealed package directly into the center of the roaring fire. The dry, thick parchment caught instantly. The flames curled around the edges, turning the bright cream color to a dark, sickly brown before disintegrating into fragile black ash. The heavy crimson wax melted and dripped into the glowing embers like blood. "Make sure it burns completely," Richard commanded, finally abandoning the desk and stepping over to the hearth. He watched the paper turn to ash, a slow, incredibly ugly smile spreading across his face. The frantic energy drained out of his shoulders, replaced by a deep, arrogant satisfaction. "Stir the ashes. If there is even a corner of a signature left, the probate judge will order an investigation." Evelyn picked up the iron poker and aggressively smashed the fragile black remains of the envelope until nothing was left but a fine, gray dust mixed with the regular wood ash. "It is gone," Evelyn whispered, standing up and brushing a speck of soot from her immaculate black skirt. She let out a long, shaky breath, her eyes shining with greed. "It is actually gone, Richard. He really thought he could cut us out. He really thought he could leave a $20 million empire to a glorified farmhand just because she knew how to roast a bean." "The old man was senile," Richard scoffed, turning back to the desk. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a completely different document. It was an older, slightly yellowed manila folder. "This is the only reality the courts are going to see. The original trust document from 15 years ago, the one where we are named the sole universal beneficiaries of the entire estate. We will have the corporate accounts frozen by tomorrow morning, and the developers from Chicago will have the demolition contracts signed by Friday. They were going to pave over 80 years of history. They were going to bulldoze the roasters, burn the orchards, and sell the soil to a commercial real estate firm for a massive, immediate cash payout. They had planned this entire execution while the man who built it was taking his final, struggling breaths in the room directly above them. I did not scream. I did not drop the silver coffee tray. I did not rush into the room to try and pull the burning paper from the flames. In the corporate world and in the world of agriculture, reacting with uncontrolled emotion is the fastest way to lose your leverage. I simply stepped out of the shadows and let the heavy silver tray clatter loudly onto the glass surface of the entryway table. The sharp, metallic crash echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. Richard and Evelyn violently jumped, spinning around to face the doorway. Richard instinctively tried to hide the old manila folder behind his back, his face completely pale. Evelyn dropped the iron poker, her hand flying to her throat in panic. They stared at me. I stared back at them, my face a completely blank, unreadable mask. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire consuming the last microscopic pieces of the stolen inheritance and the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Then, when Richard realized I was the only person standing in the hallway, the panic instantly vanished from his eyes. It was immediately replaced by a cold, aggressive superiority. He pulled the manila folder back out from behind his back and dropped it heavily onto the center of the mahogany desk. "You should learn to knock," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. He adjusted his silk tie, fully stepping into the role of the undisputed master of the house. The door was wide open. "Richard," I replied, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of the tears or hysteria they were entirely expecting. "And you are currently standing in an office you have not visited in over a decade." Evelyn stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The mask of the grieving daughter was completely gone. She looked at me with the exact same disdain she reserved for the hired seasonal workers in the fields. "Watch your tone," Evelyn snapped. "Now this is an incredibly difficult night for this family. We are currently securing your grandfather's legal documents for the probate court tomorrow morning." "Are you securing them?" I asked softly, my eyes slowly shifting from her face to the roaring fire in the hearth. "Or are you incinerating them?" The air in the room suddenly turned to ice. They knew that I had seen it. They knew that I had stood in the doorway long enough to watch them commit a massive, undeniable federal felony. But instead of fear, I saw a terrifying, calculating arrogance settle over Richard's face. He knew exactly how the justice system worked for people with money and how it worked for people without it. "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," Richard said smoothly, a sickeningly confident smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He picked up the old manila folder and tapped it against the desk. "This is the sole legally binding last will and testament of this estate, and it names Evelyn and myself as the absolute beneficiaries. There are no other documents." He took a slow, deliberate step toward me. "If you decide to go to a judge and claim that you magically saw us burning a different document," Richard continued, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register, "you will sound like a desperate, hysterical, grieving granddaughter who is incredibly bitter that she was left out of the money. You have absolutely no proof. You have no video. And you have no witnesses. It will be your word against the word of 2 respected society members with a team of corporate lawyers." Evelyn crossed her arms, a triumphant, cruel smile spreading across her face. "We appreciate the years you spent bringing your grandfather his meals and playing in the dirt out back," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with fake, sickening sympathy. "But the adults are handling the business now. Your services are no longer required." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the heavy oak front door at the end of the hallway. "You have exactly 1 hour to pack whatever cheap clothes you have in your room and vacate our property," Evelyn ordered. "If you are still inside this house when the sun comes up, I will have the county sheriff arrest you for criminal trespassing." I looked at the ashes floating in the hot air above the fireplace. I looked at the old, or outdated will resting on the mahogany desk. And finally, I looked at the two people who had just cemented their own absolute destruction. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. 1 hour, I said quietly. I turned around and walked away, leaving them alone in the office to celebrate their victory. They truly believed they had just won a $20 million empire. They had absolutely no idea what the old man had actually left for them in that drawer. The heavy, polished oak doors of the county probate courthouse swung open precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. Exactly 3 weeks had passed since the night of the fire in the mahogany office. 3 weeks since I had packed a single canvas duffel bag, handed my keys to the estate manager, and walked away from the 200 acres of prime coffee fields I had cultivated for a decade. The courtroom was entirely devoid of the warmth and history of the farm. It was a massive, sterile cavern built of cold white marble, dark walnut panels, and absolute, unforgiving authority. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and the sharp chemical scent of expensive dry cleaning. I walked down the center aisle and took a seat on the solid wooden bench in the third row of the gallery. I wore a simple, dark, tailored suit. I did not bring a briefcase. I did not bring a thick stack of frantic legal objections. I sat with my hands folded quietly in my lap and my posture perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable, calm mask. I was entirely alone. 2 rows ahead of me, sitting at the polished petitioner's table, the grieving family was putting on a master class in theatrical performance. Richard and Evelyn looked like they had just stepped off the cover of a high society magazine. Evelyn wore a stunning, custom-tailored black designer dress, her face veiled perfectly by a thin black lace fascinator. She clutched a pristine white silk handkerchief, dabbing delicately at her completely dry eyes. Richard sat beside her in a dark charcoal gray 3-piece suit, his gold Rolex watch glinting under the harsh fluorescent courtroom lights. He was speaking in hushed, confident tones to their legal representation, a sleek, highly aggressive corporate litigation attorney named Vance, who charged $2,000 an hour and specialized in rapid asset liquidation. They were not acting like a family preparing to honor a legacy, and they were acting like a corporate board of directors preparing to announce a hostile takeover, and they had already brought the buyers. Sitting directly across the aisle from me in the gallery were 3 men wearing sharp, slate-gray suits. They were the commercial real estate developers from Chicago. They had not come to pay their respects to an 80-year-old coffee pioneer. They had come to watch the gavel fall. Peeking out from the leather briefcase resting on the floor next to the lead developer was a glossy architectural rendering. Even from 6 feet away, I could see the colorful blueprints of the massive, soulless commercial shopping center and luxury condominium complex they intended to build directly over the charred remains of my grandfather's roasting warehouses. Richard turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the gallery. When his gaze locked onto me sitting alone in the third row, his confident, hushed whispering stopped. A slow, vicious, and utterly arrogant smirk spread across his face. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, deliberately adjusting his silk tie, projecting complete and total dominance. He actually believed my presence in the courtroom was an act of pathetic desperation. He thought I had come to beg the judge for a fraction of the inheritance, or perhaps to cry in front of the gallery about the unfairness of it all. He thought I was showing up to a gunfight with absolutely nothing but empty pockets and hurt feelings. Evelyn noticed him looking. She turned her head, peered through her expensive black lace veil, and let out a soft, dismissive scoff that was loud enough to carry across the silent marble room. She leaned over and whispered something to her high-priced lawyer, who let out a sharp, quiet laugh and shook his head, not even bothering to look back at me. They had the outdated manila folder, and they had the connections. They had the developers waiting in the wings. In their minds, the war was already won. "All rise!" The heavy, booming voice of the courtroom bailiff shattered the quiet murmuring. "The Honorable Judge Marcus Sterling presiding. Court is now in session." The entire room stood in synchronized unison. From the heavy wooden door behind the bench, Judge Sterling emerged. He was a stern, gray-haired man with deep lines etched into his face, in a man who had spent 3 decades presiding over the ugly, vicious wars that families wage over dead relatives' money. He took his seat at the elevated bench, adjusted his reading glasses, and opened the thick, heavy legal binder resting in front of him. "You may be seated," Judge Sterling commanded, his voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. He looked down at the docket. "We are here today for the preliminary probate hearing regarding the estate of the late Thomas Montgomery. I have a petition for the immediate execution of the last will and testament, filed by the primary beneficiaries, Richard and Evelyn Montgomery. Counsel, are you prepared to proceed?" Vance, the sleek corporate attorney, stood up instantly, aggressively buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He projected the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man holding a winning lottery ticket. "We are, Your Honor," Vance stated, his voice smooth and heavily practiced, and he picked up the slightly yellowed manila folder from the petitioner's table. "We are submitting to the court the original, legally binding last will and testament of Thomas Montgomery, drafted and fully executed 15 years ago. Under the explicit terms of this document, my clients, the deceased's only son and daughter-in-law, are named as the sole, universal heirs and absolute executors of the entire estate, including all real property, corporate holdings, and liquid assets." Judge Sterling extended his hand, and the courtroom bailiff retrieved the manila folder, carrying it up the wooden steps to the bench. The judge opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first page, checking the dates, the signatures, and the notary stamps. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, suffocating, and incredibly tense. I watched the Chicago developers physically lean forward in their wooden benches, their eyes glued to the judge's pen. "Counsel," Judge Sterling said slowly, looking up from the yellowed pages over the rim of his glasses. "This document is 15 years old. It is highly unusual for an estate of this massive size and corporate complexity to remain entirely unamended for a decade and a half. Has the family conducted a thorough, exhaustive search of the deceased's personal property, his offices, and his safe deposit boxes to ensure no subsequent documents or codicils were executed?" This was the moment. This was the exact razor-wire trap that had been waiting for them since the night of the fire. Vance did not answer the question. As a lawyer, he could only present what his clients gave him. Instead, Vance turned gracefully to Richard and Evelyn, gesturing for them to stand. "Your Honor," Vance said smoothly, "my clients are prepared to swear under oath regarding the absolute validity and finality of this document." Judge Sterling nodded, his expression turning entirely serious. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, please raise your right hands." Richard and Evelyn stood up perfectly straight. They raised their right hands, their faces solemn masks of manufactured grief and absolute certainty. "Do you swear, under the absolute penalty of perjury and fraud, that you have conducted a thorough search of the estate, and that the document presented to this court today is, to your complete and unalterable knowledge, the final, singular, and only existing last will and testament of Thomas Montgomery?" the judge asked, his voice carrying the heavy, lethal weight of federal law. Richard did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He looked directly into the eyes of the judge, completely burying the memory of the heavy cream envelope burning in the stone fireplace. "I do, Your Honor," Richard swore clearly, his voice echoing in the marble room. "It is the only document." "I do, Your Honor," Evelyn echoed softly, or dabbing a completely fake tear from her cheek. "We searched everywhere. This was his final wish." I closed my eyes for one brief, profound second. A cold, incredibly dark satisfaction bloomed in the center of my chest. It was done. By speaking those exact words into the official recorded microphone of a federal probate court, they had not just lied to a judge. They had actively, undeniably committed the felony of perjury and the felony of attempting to defraud a legal probate proceeding. And they had just locked the heavy steel doors of their own prison cell from the inside. "Very well," Judge Sterling said, picking up his heavy black fountain pen. "Based on the sworn testimony of the primary heirs and the verified signatures on the submitted documentation, I am prepared to sign the order transferring absolute executive control of the Montgomery estate to—" The judge's pen hovered exactly 1 inch above the thick, dotted line of the legal transfer order. "Objection, Your Honor." The voice did not come from the expensive corporate lawyer at the front table. It did not come from me in the gallery. It came from the heavy oak doors at the very back of the courtroom. The entire room whipped their heads around in synchronized shock. Standing in the center aisle, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane, was Arthur Pendleton. He was 82 years old, wearing a beautifully tailored but slightly frayed tweed suit. He had been my grandfather's personal estate attorney for over 40 years, a man Richard and Evelyn had aggressively fired and banned from the property the exact morning after the old man died. Arthur did not look intimidated by the massive courtroom. He did not look intimidated by the sleek corporate lawyer glaring at him. He looked like a man who had come to burn a corrupt empire to the ground. Clutched tightly in Arthur's weathered left hand was a highly secure, digital encrypted hard drive, and a thick, heavy, clear plastic evidence bag filled with fine gray dust. "I apologize for the dramatic interruption, Judge Sterling," Arthur said, his raspy voice cutting through the shocked silence of the room with absolute razor-sharp authority. He began a slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle, his cane clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. "But if you sign that order, you will be validating a massive, coordinated federal crime." The rhythmic or heavy clicking of Arthur Pendleton's wooden cane against the polished marble floor echoed through the massive courtroom like the ticking of a bomb. Every single head in the gallery, the jury box, and the petitioner's table turned to watch the 82-year-old attorney make his slow, deliberate approach down the center aisle. Richard Montgomery froze entirely. The triumphant, arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face just 3 seconds ago evaporated instantly, now replaced by a stark, absolute pallor. Beside him, Evelyn's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her pristine white silk handkerchief with such violent force that her knuckles turned a sharp, translucent white. Vance, their $2,000 an hour corporate litigation attorney, scrambled to his feet, his chair screeching harshly against the floor, his sleek, confident demeanor shattered, instantly replaced by the aggressive panic of a man watching his guaranteed payout circle the drain. "Objection, Your Honor!" Vance practically shouted, pointing a completely unprofessional finger at the elderly man walking toward the wooden gate. "I object in the absolute strongest terms. Arthur Pendleton has absolutely no legal standing in this courtroom. He was formally, legally, terminated as counsel by the executors of the Montgomery estate exactly 21 days ago. He has no right to address this court, and his interruption is a blatant, desperate attempt to derail a verified legal proceeding." Judge Marcus Sterling did not slam his heavy wooden gavel. He did not need to. He simply removed his reading glasses, leaned over the elevated mahogany bench, and fixed Vance with a stare so incredibly cold it could have frozen the air in the room. "Mr. Vance," Judge Sterling said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute silence. Arthur Pendleton has practiced law in this county for over 40 years. He has a reputation for absolute, unshakable integrity. If an officer of this court walks into my courtroom and explicitly states that I am about to validate a massive, coordinated federal crime based on the sworn testimony of your clients, I am going to listen to every single word he has to say. You will sit down and you will remain completely silent until I instruct you otherwise." Vance swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. He slowly lowered his arm and sank back into his heavy leather chair, completely neutralized. Arthur reached the low wooden gate separating the gallery from the legal tables. He pushed it open, stepping into the center well of the courtroom. He did not look at Richard or Evelyn. He treated them as if they were entirely invisible. He walked directly to the primary evidence table positioned below the judge's bench. With slow, incredibly deliberate movements, Arthur placed the items he was carrying onto the polished wood. First, he set down the heavy, highly secured digital encrypted hard drive. Second, he placed a thick, transparent plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was a pile of fine, fragile gray dust and black soot. "I appreciate your indulgence, Judge Sterling," Arthur began, his raspy voice steady and carrying the lethal weight of a meticulously planned ambush. 3 weeks ago, my client, Thomas Montgomery, passed away. With the morning after his death, his son and daughter-in-law arrived at the estate, immediately terminated my legal services, barred me from the property, and claimed they were the sole heirs based on a document drafted exactly 15 years ago. Arthur gestured toward the yellowed manila folder resting on the judge's bench. "The document you are holding, Your Honor, is legally worthless," Arthur stated flatly. Exactly 30 days prior to his passing, Thomas Montgomery executed a complete, irrevocable living trust. He legally transferred every single corporate asset, every bank account, and all 200 acres of the historic coffee roastery entirely out of his personal estate, effectively bypassing the probate process completely. That 15-year-old, well, your petitioners just swore under oath was the final document, is nothing more than a historical artifact. A shocked, breathless gasp rippled through the gallery. Across the aisle, the 3 commercial real estate developers from Chicago abruptly sat up straight. The lead developer violently shoved the glossy architectural blueprints back into his leather briefcase, his face turning a dark shade of red. He realized instantly that Richard and Evelyn had just tried to sell them land they did not legally own. "If the estate was transferred into a living trust, Mr. Pendleton," Judge Sterling asked, narrowing his eyes in intense legal curiosity, "why are we currently sitting in a probate hearing regarding a fraudulent will?" Arthur finally turned his head. He looked directly at Richard and Evelyn. Richard was sweating profusely. A thick bead of cold perspiration rolled down his temple, soaking into the collar of his expensive charcoal gray suit. Evelyn looked as if she were about to physically vomit right there at the petitioner's table. "Because, Your Honor," Arthur continued, his voice echoing brutally in the silent room, Thomas Montgomery knew exactly who his children were. He knew they had spent the last decade waiting for him to die so they could pave over his legacy and sell it to the highest commercial bidder. He knew they would break into his private office before his body was even removed from the house. Arthur reached out and tapped a single weathered finger against the thick plastic evidence bag filled with ash. To prove their absolute unfitness and to protect the true beneficiary of the estate, Thomas instructed me to lay a trap, Arthur revealed, his words striking the courtroom like physical blows. We placed a decoy document in the bottom drawer of his heavy mahogany desk. It was sealed inside a thick, cream-colored envelope with a heavy crimson wax seal, but it did not contain a will. I sat in the third row of the gallery, watching the absolute destruction of my parents' lives unfold with forensic precision. I remembered the smell of the lighter fluid. I remembered Evelyn aggressively stabbing the flames with the iron poker. The paper inside that decoy envelope was custom milled by a specialized forensic accounting firm in New York, Arthur explained, delivering the killing blow to their entire defense. It was heavily saturated with a rare inert chemical compound, a proprietary isotopic tracer mixed with barium sulfate. It is completely invisible to the naked eye, but it is scientifically designed to survive extreme incineration temperatures up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The courtroom was so entirely silent, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents in the ceiling. Exactly 12 hours after Thomas passed away, while the petitioners were busy securing demolition contracts, Arthur said, I dispatched a licensed private investigator to the estate with a court-ordered access permit. And the investigator extracted these ashes directly from the stone fireplace in the main office. Attached to this evidence bag is a certified mass spectrometry report confirming the heavy presence of the specific isotopic tracer. Arthur looked back up at the judge. Your Honor, the petitioners did not just lie by omission, Arthur stated, his voice turning to cold, hard steel. They discovered what they believed to be a valid legal will. Did they intentionally incinerated it in a fireplace to completely destroy the evidence? And then they stood in your courtroom, raised their right hands, and swore under the penalty of perjury that no other documents existed. Judge Sterling's face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. He looked down at Richard and Evelyn not as grieving family members, but as two individuals who had just insulted the absolute integrity of his federal courtroom. To eliminate any shadow of a doubt regarding his intentions, Arthur concluded, picking up the encrypted hard drive, Thomas Montgomery recorded a sworn, time-stamped video deposition on the exact day he established the Living Trust. I formally request permission to connect this drive to the courtroom's audio-visual system. Permission granted, Judge Sterling ordered immediately, slamming his hand down on the button connecting him to the bailiff's desk. Bailiff, drop the screens and connect the drive. Vance did not object. He did not stand up. He sat completely paralyzed in his chair, staring blankly at the polished table, rapidly calculating how to extract himself from representing two clients who had just committed a federal felony on the public record. 4 massive, high-definition flat screens silently descended from the vaulted ceiling of the courtroom, angling downward so the gallery, the legal tables, and the judge had a perfect, unobstructed view. The bailiff plugged the heavy encrypted drive into the secure terminal. He clicked the mouse. The screens flickered to life. The image was incredibly sharp, recorded in full-color high definition. The background was the unmistakable dark wood paneling of the historic mahogany office at the center of the estate. Sitting directly in the center of the frame, occupying his massive leather chair, was my grandfather. He looked incredibly frail, and the illness clearly taking its toll on his body, but his sharp, piercing blue eyes burned with the exact same fierce, uncompromising intensity that had built his empire from nothing. He was holding his favorite ceramic mug, a dark wisp of steam rising from the freshly roasted black coffee inside. He looked directly into the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall, staring straight into the souls of the people sitting in the courtroom. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. Then he set the mug down on the desk with a heavy, definitive clunk. "Hello, Richard. Hello, Evelyn." My grandfather's deep, gravelly voice boomed through the high-fidelity speakers of the courtroom, sounding as if he had just stepped out of the grave to deliver their sentence himself. Richard physically recoiled in his chair, his breath hitching audibly in his throat. Evelyn covered her mouth with both hands, tears of absolute, genuine terror finally spilling down her cheeks. "When if Arthur is playing this video for a judge," the old man on the screen continued, a cold, knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth, "it means my trap worked flawlessly. It means you couldn't even wait for the dirt to settle on my coffin before you tried to burn my legacy to the ground." The high-definition screens illuminated the cold marble walls of the courtroom with a harsh, bright light. The audio system, designed to capture the softest whispers of a witness stand, amplified my grandfather's deep, gravelly voice until it filled every single corner of the massive room. He was not speaking like a man on his deathbed. He was speaking like a king, passing a final, absolute judgment on two traitors standing before his throne. Richard Montgomery was entirely paralyzed. He sat rigidly in his heavy leather chair, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide and fixed on the massive flat screen suspended above the judge's bench, and the pristine charcoal gray three-piece suit he had worn to project absolute dominance now looked like a suffocating straitjacket. A thick, visible bead of cold sweat rolled slowly down his temple, tracing the line of his jaw before dripping onto his expensive silk tie. Evelyn was violently trembling. She had dropped her pristine white silk handkerchief onto the floor, and her hands were clutching the edge of the polished wooden petitioner's table so tightly that her knuckles were entirely bloodless. "You thought I was blind, Richard," my grandfather continued on the screen, his piercing blue eyes staring directly through the camera lens, cutting through the decades of their manufactured high society facade. "You thought my illness had rotted my mind just as it was rotting my lungs. For 15 years, you did not call. You did not visit the estate. Well, you did not ask how the harvest was doing. You and your wife spent your entire adult lives attending charity galas and country club dinners, spending money you did not earn, completely ashamed of the fact that your family wealth came from dirt, sweat, and roasting coffee beans." My grandfather took another slow, deliberate sip from his ceramic mug. He set it down with a heavy, resonant thud that echoed through the courtroom speakers. "But you were perfectly willing to take the money," the old man growled, his voice dropping into a register of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You hovered around my periphery like vultures, waiting for my heart to finally give out so you could swoop in, pave over 80 years of my blood and sweat, and sell the soil to a commercial real estate firm for a quick, massive cash payout. You thought you were so incredibly clever." Across the center aisle of the gallery, the three commercial real estate developers from Chicago were no longer leaning forward in anticipation. They were actively packing up their belongings. The lead developer, his face flushed dark red with extreme professional embarrassment and fury, violently shoved his glossy architectural blueprints into his leather briefcase. He snapped the brass lock shut with a sharp, echoing click. Without waiting to be excused, the three men stood up in unison, turned their backs on Richard and Evelyn, and walked rapidly out of the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. Their guaranteed multi-million-dollar demolition project had just evaporated into thin air. "I knew exactly what you would do the moment the coroner carried my body out of the master bedroom," my grandfather's voice boomed, completely ignoring the commotion in the gallery. "I knew you would break into my private mahogany office. I knew you would tear through my antique desk looking for a will. And I knew that if you found a document that did not name you as the absolute beneficiaries, you would destroy it without a second thought." On the screen, my grandfather reached down below the frame of the camera. When his hand returned to the desk, he was holding a thick, bound legal document enclosed in a heavy leather folio. Exactly 30 days before recording this video, I sat in this exact chair with Arthur Pendleton, the old man declared, holding the heavy folio up to the camera lens. So I formally, legally, and irrevocably transferred every single acre of the farm, every single corporate account, and the entirety of the roasting facilities into a living trust. And I named the only person in this family who actually earned it as the sole, absolute trustee and singular beneficiary. He looked directly into the camera, and for the very first time in the recording, the cold, lethal anger vanished from his eyes. It was replaced by a profound, overwhelming warmth. She spent the last 10 years of her life keeping this empire alive, my grandfather said softly, his voice thick with genuine emotion. While you two were drinking champagne in Chicago, she was standing in the roasting facility at 4 o'clock in the morning, covered in soot, managing the supply chains and making sure the legacy survived. The farm belongs to her. It always belonged to her. I sat in the third row of the gallery, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded quietly in my lap. I did not break down crying. I did not throw my arms up in victory, but the heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest for the last 3 weeks, the agonizing fear that I had lost the only home I had ever known, completely dissolved. The cold satisfaction radiating through my veins was absolute. He had seen me. He had always seen me. The warmth in my grandfather's eyes vanished, replaced once again by the cold, unforgiving stare of a predator locking onto its prey. To ensure you could never drag her into a prolonged, decade-long legal battle, I instructed Arthur to have a forensic decoy printed on chemically traceable paper, my grandfather explained, detailing the exact architecture of his trap. I knew you would burn it. I knew you would present the outdated 15-year-old document to a judge, and I knew your own monumental arrogance would force you to swear under oath that it was my final wish. My grandfather leaned forward, on his face filling the high-definition screen. Judge Sterling. My grandfather addressed the court directly, his voice echoing with the heavy, unshakable weight of a man demanding absolute justice from beyond the grave. If you are watching this recording, it means my son and my daughter-in-law have stood in your federal courtroom and committed blatant, undeniable perjury. And it means they intentionally destroyed what they believed to be a legal document in an attempt to defraud this court and steal a $20 million estate. I have protected my legacy. I now leave it entirely to the justice system to hold them accountable for their crimes. The screen instantly snapped to black. The sudden silence in the massive marble courtroom was so profound, so absolutely complete, it felt like a physical vacuum. The 4 high-definition screens slowly retracted back into the vaulted ceiling, their mechanical motors humming softly in the quiet room. Judge Marcus Sterling sat behind the elevated mahogany bench, his face entirely frozen in a mask of lethal, unadulterated judicial fury. He did not look at the heavy black fountain pen resting on his desk. He did not look at Arthur Pendleton. He slowly, deliberately turned his head to look directly down at the petitioner's table. Richard Montgomery looked as if he had just suffered a massive, catastrophic stroke. He was staring blankly at the empty space where the screen had been, his jaw slack, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Evelyn was sobbing openly now, the theatrical, fake tears she had cried earlier, completely replaced by the ugly, chaotic weeping of a woman who had just realized her life of luxury was entirely over. But the most spectacular reaction did not come from the parents, and it came from their $2,000 an hour corporate litigation attorney. Vance had not spoken a single word since Arthur Pendleton began his presentation. He had sat perfectly still, absorbing the catastrophic radioactive fallout of the forensic evidence and the sworn video deposition. He was a highly intelligent man, and he knew exactly what happened to lawyers who knowingly facilitated perjury and fraud in a federal courtroom. They lost their licenses, and they went to prison. Vance stood up. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at Evelyn. He did not attempt to whisper a strategy or offer a single word of comfort. He unlatched his expensive leather briefcase, picked up his notepad, his expensive pens, and his legal files and shoved them violently into the bag. He snapped the brass lock shut with a sharp, definitive crack. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice completely devoid of the smooth, arrogant confidence he had projected 20 minutes ago. Or his tone was now strictly procedural, entirely focused on his own professional survival. In light of the evidence presented by Mr. Pendleton, specifically the revelation of intentional document destruction and perjury committed by my clients without my prior knowledge or consent, I find myself in an immediate, irreconcilable ethical conflict. Vance grabbed the handle of his briefcase and took a large, deliberate step away from Richard and Evelyn, or physically and legally distancing himself from the toxic radiation of their crimes. "I must formally and immediately petition this court for an emergency withdrawal as the legal counsel of record for Richard and Evelyn Montgomery," Vance declared loudly, ensuring the court stenographer recorded every single syllable of his defection. Judge Sterling did not hesitate for a microsecond. "Petition to withdraw is granted immediately, Counselor," Judge Sterling barked, his voice dripping with venom. "Why, you are officially dismissed from this proceeding. You may leave the well." Vance did not say goodbye to his clients. He turned on his heel, pushed open the low wooden gate, and practically sprinted down the center aisle of the courtroom, desperate to escape the building before the federal marshals locked the doors. Richard and Evelyn were now entirely, completely alone. They had no lawyer. They had no developers. They had no inheritance. They had nothing but a massive, undeniable pile of forensic evidence sitting on the table in front of a furious federal judge. Judge Sterling picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He did not tap it lightly. He slammed it down onto the sounding block with a violent, explosive crack that made Evelyn physically shriek in terror. "Richard and Evelyn Montgomery," Judge Sterling roared, his voice shaking the heavy walnut panels of the courtroom. "You have stood in my courtroom and made an absolute mockery of the federal justice system. You have committed blatant, premeditated perjury on the official public record." The judge slammed his hand down on the secure emergency button located beneath his mahogany desk. "Bailiff!" Judge Sterling commanded, pointing a single shaking finger directly at the two terrified socialites cowering at the petitioner's table. "Secure the doors to this courtroom immediately. Do not let anyone in or out." From the corners of the massive marble room, 3 heavily armed courtroom deputies immediately stepped forward, their hands resting instinctively on their utility belts. The heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery slammed shut with a loud, echoing boom. The loud, echoing boom of the heavy oak doors slamming shut completely sealed their fate. The courtroom was no longer a venue for a civil probate hearing. It had instantly transformed into a federal holding cell. Richard Montgomery, and a man who had spent his entire 62 years of life believing that his wealth and his last name made him entirely untouchable, finally hit a solid brick wall that he could not buy his way over. His perfectly manicured hands began to shake uncontrollably. He looked wildly around the massive marble room, his eyes darting from the furious judge to the 3 heavily armed courtroom deputies advancing slowly down the center aisle. Evelyn completely broke down. The sheer, overwhelming terror of losing her absolute freedom and her life of luxury shattered her manufactured high society facade into a million irreparable pieces. "No, please, Judge Sterling, wait!" Evelyn shrieked, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated panic. She threw her hands up, the expensive black lace veil tearing slightly, as she practically clawed at the air. "We did not know. We thought it was a draft. We were just confused. Richard, tell him we were confused." Richard did not speak, and he could not form a single coherent word. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving violently beneath his expensive, tailored charcoal gray waistcoat. Judge Marcus Sterling did not offer a single ounce of judicial sympathy. He leaned over the heavy mahogany bench, his eyes burning with absolute, unforgiving authority. "Evelyn Montgomery, save your pathetic, transparent lies for your federal defense attorney," Judge Sterling thundered, his voice completely drowning out her hysterical sobbing. "You stood in my courtroom, placed your right hand in the air, and explicitly swore under the penalty of perjury that you had not altered, destroyed, or concealed any legal documents pertaining to this $20 million estate. We just watched a sworn, time-stamped video deposition confirming the existence of a forensic decoy, and we have a certified mass spectrometry report proving you intentionally incinerated it in a stone fireplace." The three armed deputies reached the low wooden gate, and they did not ask politely. They unclipped the heavy cold steel handcuffs from their black tactical belts, the sharp metallic clinking sound echoing brutally over Evelyn's desperate cries. "Richard and Evelyn Montgomery," Judge Sterling declared, formally delivering the killing blow to their entire existence. "I am immediately holding both of you in direct, criminal contempt of court. Furthermore, based on the irrefutable forensic evidence and the sworn video deposition presented by Arthur Pendleton, I am ordering the bailiff to remand you into federal custody pending formal felony charges for first-degree perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud upon the court, and the intentional destruction of legal estate documents." "You cannot do this to us. We are the Montgomery family. We own this town," Evelyn wailed, thrashing wildly as a broad-shouldered deputy grabbed her arms and aggressively forced them behind her back. The heavy steel cuffs ratcheted shut around her wrists with a sharp, violent bite. The sound was incredibly final. "You own absolutely nothing, Mrs. Montgomery," Judge Sterling replied coldly, lifting his heavy wooden gavel. "Take them out of my sight." Richard did not fight. When the second deputy grabbed his shoulder and pulled his arms behind his back, his knees simply buckled. He was hauled to his feet, completely limp, his gold Rolex watch sliding uselessly down his wrist as the cold steel handcuffs locked him into his new reality. The deputies marched them roughly down the center aisle of the gallery. They did not look like wealthy, untouchable socialites anymore. They looked entirely broken. As they passed the third row, Evelyn turned her head, her ruined, mascara-stained face locking onto mine. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded quietly in my lap, projecting the absolute, unshakable calm of a woman who had just successfully defended an 80-year-old empire. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and offered her absolutely nothing but a cold, blank stare. The deputies shoved them through the heavy oak doors, and their desperate, echoing cries faded rapidly down the long marble corridor toward the subterranean holding cells. The massive courtroom was suddenly completely quiet again. Judge Sterling let out a long, heavy breath, adjusting his judicial robes before turning his attention back to the elderly attorney, standing calmly in the center well. "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Sterling said, his tone softening significantly, returning to a register of deep, professional respect. "The court officially recognizes the irrevocable living trust established by the late Thomas Montgomery. When the 15-year-old document submitted by the petitioners is hereby stricken from the record entirely and ruled fraudulently presented, the estate, the corporate holdings, and the physical property are officially and permanently released into the absolute executive control of the named trustee." Arthur Pendleton smiled. It was a small, incredibly proud smile. He bowed his head slightly toward the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor," Arthur rasped. He turned around, leaning heavily on his wooden cane, and looked directly at me in the gallery. "The coffee roastery is officially yours, exactly as your grandfather intended." I finally let out a slow, trembling breath. A single tear of absolute, overwhelming relief escaped my eye, tracking hotly down my cheek. The war was over. The legacy was safe. 18 months later, the heavy mahogany office at the center of the estate smelled exactly as it was supposed to. It smelled of dark roast Arabica beans, aged leather, and the sweet, lingering memory of my grandfather. I sat behind the massive antique desk, reviewing the international export contracts for our upcoming spring harvest. Outside the large bay windows, the 200 acres of historic coffee fields were thriving. We had just broken ground on a brand new, state-of-the-art roasting facility, entirely funded by the corporate accounts my parents had so desperately tried to steal. Richard and Evelyn never returned to their expensive Chicago penthouse. The federal prosecutors offered them a brutal, uncompromising plea deal. Faced with the absolute certainty of the forensic ash analysis and the video deposition, they pled guilty to 2 counts of federal perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. They were both sentenced to 48 months in a federal correctional institution, followed by 5 years of heavily monitored probation. And they were completely bankrupted by their defense lawyers. Their high society friends abandoned them instantly, treating their names like a toxic, contagious disease. Evelyn, a woman who had once threatened to have me arrested for trespassing in my own home, was now spending her days wearing a state-issued khaki uniform, scrubbing cafeteria trays for 22 cents an hour. Richard, who had arrogantly checked his gold Rolex while burning my grandfather's final wishes, was now living in an 8-by-10-foot concrete cell where time meant absolutely nothing at all. They had tried to burn my future to ashes. Instead, they had provided the exact fuel required to permanently remove themselves from my life, leaving me to run a $20 million empire in absolute peace. If your greedy parents tried to burn your grandfather's will to steal your inheritance, would you have warned them about the trap or let them commit perjury in a federal courtroom? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.